Hello everyone, today we talk about the millennial fears in the year 1000. So the wait for the end of times in the new age that, telling the truth, has really a few to do with the year 1000. That this is what we will see today. A few. I'm not saying everything. It's mostly a myth that was created chiefly by romantic historiography, so much later in time. And that definitely was, couldn't be really in that way for many reasons that we will try to explain today. But at the same time, we will also deal with definitely beliefs that existed still at that, obviously at that time, regarding the end of the world and what it could really be like. A beautiful thing would be to go back in time and ask, I don't know, the average peasant, whose voice we basically never hear in sources. What was it like? What did they think, really? And as well as to others, to priests, to knights, to... But aside from this, starting with the myth, starting with how this was all created, as I just mentioned, it was chiefly a romantic myth created, therefore, around the essentially the 19th century, and partly also dealing with the previous ones that had formed in the Enlightenment, and we'll see how this was combined. And this myth basically consists in the idea that the last day of the first millennium of Christ, people, basically Christians, naturally, practically would have gathered, all trembling around churches and monasteries, waiting for the trumpet of the the horns of the great judgment. And and the myth goes on with this, even with this story, that people waited for the whole night, and at the dawn of the following millennium, saying that nothing had taken place. Basically, they came back to their houses with this new energy and joy of living. So this is a complete nonsensical thing in practice. As I said, there are still some maybe true things that we will scope now, but generally speaking, it didn't make sense. It doesn't make sense also because chiefly of how people consider time at the time, that we will see it was a much more complicated and also partially ignored thing, because of really how society worked. Like, we were talking about the year 1000. Think about what Europe could really be at the time. First of all, there were places we weren't even Christian still, were large areas that, although Christian, namely, were actually still largely pagan, or at least that had complete different beliefs, or very different systems of measurement of time, so a very complicated thing. So this wolf false thing, how was it born, really, historiographically speaking? Well, it was actually born out of very fascinating compromise, we can say, between the 18th and 19th century beliefs on the Middle Ages. So from one side we have the 18th century Enlightenment picture that was given of the Middle Ages as essentially barbaric, dark, obscurantist, superstitious, and ignorant. From the other side, mainly the 19th century romantic view of the Middle Ages as a splendid time, the one of the cathedrals, of the birth of universities, of the values of chivalry and courtly love, So naturally two extremes, because these two views, although still very influential in our world, do not hold anymore in any academy worth of this name. Simply because we know that it wasn't so, and it was also much more complicated and much more variegated, which in my opinion also makes it more interesting. Yeah, I could open a large parenthesis on on really maybe I will do it in another video though, about how these views, especially well, actually both the Enlightenment and the and Romanticism ones still affect our picture of the Middle Ages. Like in pop culture, that's essentially it. Either you think that the Middle Age was a sort of black hole of repression and destruction and bestiality, essentially. Either you think it was such a splendid time, all, you know, the dames gathering, picking flowers while and their knights courtly torn in front of them in chivalric fashion. It was really, you know, they can be hilarious sometimes, but it's kind of still kind of nice to consider how actually certain beliefs we have about the Middle Ages actually stem from the Middle Ages themselves in part, so they're partly accurate. I mean, the idea of being courteous, for instance, being polite with women and having a certain you know, contained and gentle behavior. This idea that, I don't know, the man has to be sort of has to be courageous and proud. You know, all these things that actually are still present, sometimes unconsciously in our culture, and partly also come from previous times compared to the Middle Ages. But that's something that have really left a great mark, not just in Europe but also in other places of the world. Chivalry was something that you can find also in the Muslim world, for instance. So there are actually many similarities, and those come straight also from this literary tradition of medieval times, who were pretty widespread all over Europe, the Mediterranean, and even beyond. And that really made sort of sometimes one of the few universal codes of at least from a secular point of view. Also, definitely certain religious views were still in common within the Abrahamic religions, but that's also another story. So passing through how to explain why actually the fear of the year 1000 is false, it's very important to to stress relatively to this the impossibility around the year 1000 to even determine in a uniform way when the year 1000 would actually occur. First of all, you know, now there would be, I will surely make a video about medieval calendars, but I'll have to deal with them also now in part. And substantially, we have to think that the datation system, the one of that had been proposed essentially by the 6th century Syrian monk Dionysius Exiguus in Latin. That is Dionysius the humble, or usually at least in English. That is the one that's essentially still our calendar is based on. Was had been accepted, barely accepted, and it began to basically spread only between the 8th and the 10th century. So according to this datation system, basically towards the abolition of the so-called martyrs era or Diocletian's era, that basically counted the years from this events, this of the cross at the time of Diocletian. This was basically used, for instance, since the 4th century A.D. by the Church of Alexandria, and it is still actually to this present, and Westerners in part had adopted it, and this was actually being created for chiefly for kind of celebrating the last major persecutions against the Christians. They began, in fact, with the same Diocletian's empire. And so it's actually very complicated, because there is even the Egyptian New Year, the Egyptian year was different, how it was conceived. It had different names. It was pretty complicated. You have to think that dating systems at the time were quite complex. Now our calendar is relatively simple and also adjusted astronomically speaking. But in those times there were so many different types of time measurement. Also consider that life and history were conceived in different ways in terms of time. People lived less. Also for certain cultural reasons. For instance, they didn't care when they were born, usually, especially from a Christian perspective. The date of your birth, the only that mattered was the date of your death, because your birth was a rebirth in Christ, essentially, in the afterlife, or better, in the true life from a Christian perspective. And so it was even meaningless to Christian culture in this sense. Certain times has been pretty harsh towards our let's say the current towards earthly existence, terrestrial existence, because it was considered as short and transitory, and really think how life could really be at that time. I mean, it was a very, very different world. If you were lucky to survive your childhood and teenage, you probably would have seen some substantial part of your peers on their deathbed, and think also about their parents and old children that they lost, so chiefly in the first days or months of life. Take how illnesses could really take you down so easily. Think about life expectancy. I mean, if you had made it to adulthood, you could hope to live to, if you were lucky, up to 60 or 70, but that was really very, very long. The majority of people died on average before. At least it also depends. There's a lot of debate relative to this, but it wasn't that enormously bad. But let's say that it was much easier to lose life for little things in general. And also history was conceived in a wholly different way. Now, since we are little, we are told today that, I don't know, there's been a history of humanity. We go back essentially to the Big Bang, also on the timeline. So we get immediately the sense of time depth, which is curiously still a linear one. That is something that came from Christianity, indeed, because before Christianity, aside from I think very few other beliefs, but the norm in the pagan world was having a sort of cyclical conception of time. That is, that practically there's not a beginning or an end. There are just certain phases that repeat themselves over and over again, and they're meant to represent the infinity and partly also the mystery of universe, in the sense that, of course, they were telling the truth certain millennial beliefs, that is essentially the Chiliasm. That is essentially the millennialism takes the name, essentially it's the same name in Latin or Greek derived term. Millennialism derives from Latin millennium, that means 1,000 years, and Chiliasm from the Greek, which means the same thing. So you can call them both, and this is actually an idea that you find in also in many other cultures. For instance, in Zoroastrianism, that also identifies certain successive 1,000 years periods, etc. And these conceptions had been taken by Christianity, essentially from the Hebraic and Hellenistic beliefs that existed. Christianity originated in a culture, in our, let's say, religious environment, was influenced, enormously influenced by lots of beliefs put together. So it's also fascinating to look at this syncretism part. So even the concept of history was like, I mean, people didn't really care. They were more attached in this sense to, I don't know, which was the, I don't know, the local, excuse me, which emperor's years it was. Since an emperor had been elected, it was the norm in the Roman Empire, for instance. So it was something, as you can understand, sometimes especially quite arbitrary. And it was also differentiated according to the needs, because it's obvious that an empire, for instance, and its institutions wanted to measure time to regulate it, not just for practical needs, but also to stress the fact that I don't know, they had been born as an empire at a certain point. Think about the, I don't know, the ab urbe condita Roman time measurement. That was kept, but that was kept really as a theoretical memory, while the common people were more practical and counted time in different ways, probably also with the ab urbe condita system, but mostly with the emperors. And most Christians actually that were Roman subjects, let's say, then were used to that time measure. They simply used that as well. So there was no uniformity really, and given the times, the spaces, the technology, it was really functional in this way. I mean, to us it might seem messy, as we are always giving a look at the calendar. We need to know, thinking about time, even over years and stuff. These people were very different. First of all, most of them lived into the countryside, with cyclical, following the seasonal cyclicity. And even they already had their time measurements that in this sense dated back to a long time, because agriculturalism is something very, very old, and it's really based on this cyclicity, and it basically repeats every year all over again. So it's kind of nature that gives you that clock. Which means that relatively to the year 1000, that the many people, as we were saying before, that maybe were Christian formally, with all the imperfections in beliefs and all, because you don't have to think that those people, aside from sometimes not even priests, were actually very, very, very educated about Christianism. Well, at that time, usually, yes. The same in pre-Carolingian times, maybe that they weren't at all. They couldn't even read the Bible properly, because they didn't know Latin, so they translated in very weird ways that, were all but meaningful in Christian sense. But let's say the common people, that is, the common European of the 11th century is a peasant that lives somewhere, even far from big centers, and works the land every day, aside from sometimes in winter. And the in that sense, what was the sense for them of having a calendar in the first place and counting even the years? I mean, what did that add to what they had to do in everyday life? Nothing, practically. So most of the people around the year 1000 probably didn't even know what year it was, and because that was calculated in the great, I don't know, monasteries like, I don't know, St. Gallen or Reichenau, or in Rome, and yeah, it was known that was such a time measurement, but it's simply that it didn't count anything for them, and they didn't know about all the great, let's say, the idea of the prophecy. The prophecies telling the truth were all around at that time, and they weren't just Christian prophecies, were a mix also with certain pagan beliefs, and they were out there all the time because it was such an unstable life, it was such a precarious life that there was always, even in paganism, this tension towards the idea of the ultimate end, of the ultimate catastrophe. You can see that even from art, from symbolism, that especially before this is the other conception, that the year 1000 was also sort of watershed between an early Middle Ages dominated by fear towards the Judgment's Day, and a low Middle Ages that is a bit more humanistic and revolving around a positive idea of not of God as a punisher, but essentially as a friend and savior, and of faith, let's say, also into the accomplishments of human society, which is partly true in the sense that the lower Middle Ages correspond also to a greater theological debate, greater awareness, as well as the triumph of Christianity, generally speaking. The early Middle Ages is a bit more complicated. It was definitely a rougher time than later times, but this is also very relative. It depends on who you were and where you were. So also in here it's a bit an arbitrary statement, but let's say on average we can't say that. So it is true that at a cultural level there were such, you can draw such a line, but it's very arbitrary, and it basically has nothing to do with the fact that in the year 1000 people believed that the world was going to end, and then it didn't happen, and we're so happy they created I don't know, the 12th century rebirth or humanism. That depended on a much greater process of growth of the European continent that brought even more wealth. So there were people who had more surplus for, say, for studying, for living a better life, to have better time conditions. By the 14th century, if you take, I don't know, I think 14th century Florence has been estimated as essentially the first equivalent to medieval history to Antonine Rome in terms of quality of life. So it's obvious that such life conditions definitely influence the way you look at the world, and there are many differences also in spaces for latitudinal problems, say reasons, better. Let's not throw the word problems around. I mean, surely a Swedish person had a wholly different view of the world in the Middle Ages from a person from, say, from Greece, because even of environmental reasons. Think about living most of the winter in darkness and in freezing, compared to a Mediterranean climate that is usually mild, and thinking how that influence your culture, your forms of expression, your interaction with your fellow neighbor, how it's very really different. The situation is very, very differentiated, and especially before the Carolingian times, that tried to put a bit of an homogeneity, especially from in terms of ecclesiastical standards. Really, all say various areas of Europe had very different traditions, even written one. Before the Caroline ladder kicked in, Europeans wrote all in different fashions. I mean, the alphabet's characters were shaped in different ways. I mean, these differences were pretty much the norm in the early Middle Ages, and they would partly continue to be in the later ones. So essentially Dionysius Exiguus had took away the era of the martyrs, or the Diocletian one, and introduced the one of Christ. That is, that Dionysius Exiguus invented essentially the Anno Domini era. So the one we basically still use. So not just Anno Domini, but also the one that came before, that is counting in reverse. Now we say before Christ, BC. So that is essentially the one that the system we're still using. And one interesting thing about it is that this system had come along also with other details. For instance, for instance, the birth of Christ. That in this sense you have to think it was calibrated on other systems, because Dionysius Exiguus was using the ab urbe condita system for saying for having a point of reference for saying that Jesus had been born on December the 25th of the year 753 of the Roman ab urbe condita system. So the Roman calendar, that was very, very important, and along with other things, because as we will see now, there were also in here many differences. And for instance, the Dionysius calendar hadn't touched, for instance, the Iberian Peninsula. That took this measurement only in the late Middle Ages, and this happened as well. It excluded as well also the Byzantine areas, let's say, or at least areas of Byzantine culture, including Venice, for instance, and large parts of southern Italy, Russia. And many other regions of Eastern Europe that had fallen essentially into the Byzantine influence practically. So that was the thing. And in these areas, these last areas, the years were counted from the say what was from the Bible, the beginning of the world. That had been calculated according to the conventional ages of the biblical patriarchs, that would be from 5508. And so think also about the problems this entailed. I mean, sometimes applying a calendar in a certain area, especially frontier in terms of, I don't know, different cultures and all, equated also at imposing a time measurement that in this sense corresponded to the one of to the authority of the local ruler. So it's not just a convention, it could be used politically as well. And another very complicated thing to determine was the beginning of the year. Now this is really complicated, and that's why I said before that I should make a video about it, because it's really a freaking mess. So basically, the beginning of the year at the time had been usually, I mean, one great point of reference in the Middle Ages was obviously the Romans, obviously. So the Romans had set the beginning of the year at the calendar of or calendar of January. That is the 1st of January. This is something that started from the 2nd century BC. It was something that had been established, if I'm not wrong, in 153 BC. And it had been important actually because the Romans basically changed the consuls on the 1st of January. By the way, the same term calendar comes from the Latin calendarium, which means the accounts register. That is when you had to pay basically debts or ask for your credit in the calendar, that is the first day of the Roman months. And Caesar famously in 46 BC had inserted another day to basically try to compensate the sun shift, the fact that the sun grew increasingly later, so that the world seasons according to the calendar had been messed up because nobody had fixed it from more than 1 century. So it's now I don't want to get into detail, but the January the 1st had been fixed by the Romans as the beginning of the year, of the new year. But during the Middle Ages, this custom had partly been lost, at least with a few exceptions, and it would have been re-established eventually only in the modern age. So it's only from the modern age that January the 1st came back generally as a general rule as the beginning of the new year. In the Middle Ages usually it wasn't really so. You have to think that as I was saying before, that every place had its basically its own tradition relatively to the first day of the year when it was. In the Byzantine influenced era, the new year was celebrated usually on September the 1st. Not everywhere though. For instance, in Venice, it corresponded to March the 1st. In Rome and in Germany, there was usually the so-called style of nativity prevailed. That is, sorry, a bit of a noise. That is basically choosing December the 25th as Christ's birth as the beginning of the new year. In many Italian cities that also figured as sort of systems on their own, it was the first day of the year was usually one of the Incarnation, That is usually March the 25th. In France, it was a bit more complicated because in there there was a lot of influence from the certain ecclesiastical measurements, and they basically did it on Easter. And Easter, as you know, is a mobile holiday, so basically it changed every year. So you can understand how complicated it really was, and this is something. It's also very important for medievalists. I think every medievalist has to know that that when you read the year in a certain source, you have to know according to which source, which day that year starts, because it might be not our own. For instance, in Florence, the new year started in March, usually. So if you find, say, I don't know, on the year 1300, well, part of the year 1300 will comprehend part of what we think of what we number as from January and March of the year 1301. So you don't have to, if you're calculating something chronologically speaking, you don't have to mess that up. And this is very important. And by the way, it's also very complicated sometimes to understand. In that case, I mean, sometimes we know that, but sometimes we don't. I mean, what was the source counting like? We don't really know. Especially in the early Middle Ages, it's very, very complicated because the sources are pretty, aside from being scanny, but sometimes they're also pretty they give up very few information, so there is no way actually to understand that. In fact, we necessarily may have some certain times of oscillations, not just within the same year, but sometimes even in many years, that can come also from simple mistakes from the guy who wrote that, because he maybe didn't know in which year that something had happened. But generally speaking, you have to take into account also these other technical problems to be sure about which time that source is actually referring to, according to our own system. So, however, there is one point that I think is important to remember relatively to the fear of the year 1000. That is not completely false in historical terms. That is, as we have seen, fears and hopes and apocalyptic weights were definitely existing throughout the whole Middle Ages and even beyond. So millennialism, or Chiliasm, as you want to call it, was already widespread in the world. Even before the rise of Christianity, we have seen the Jews had that. Certain Hellenistic traditions had that. I can think even of, I don't know, we mentioned before Zoroastrianism in Persia, or in India there were, I don't remember whether Jainism is based on that as well, but I mean, there is this kind of stages of time that kind of even correspond to this progressive, I don't remember whether it's the case of Jainism or not, but even from a Christian point of view, this was the idea that the time of mankind was kind of declining in quality. That was something that the Christians took straight from the pagan world. I mean, the idea that there had been a sort of golden age. That is roughly something, you know, if you think about the well, in the Bible it's a bit different, because there is actually a very important watershed. That is when Adam and Eve are kicked out of paradise. But even in that sense, the Christian Jewish paradise and it was something that corresponded to that thing, and the Bible was written definitely with certain other cultural influences were that were expressing that, but it was evidently a pretty widespread anthropological belief, in generally speaking, around the world. And interestingly, this was usually cyclical, as we have said, especially in the pagan world. Instead, for Christians, it wasn't, because there was a given time to the world after which the world would end, and the kingdom of heaven would reign. By the way, preceded by the rule of Satan on earth. So this was also very frightening, because, and this is something that influenced people all around in the Middle Ages, because there were people in the Middle Ages, and not only that, believed that at a certain point Satan had actually arrived. For instance, the Guelphs in the 13th century believed that Frederick II of Hohenstaufen was actually the Antichrist. And they thought that the end of the world was near, because when the Antichrist would die, everything, the end of times would have arrived. Instead, it didn't happen. And this is a story I like to tell every time. That is that even the fiercest enemies of Frederick actually stated that, because it told you. Well, that was a prophecy that had been said by Joachim of Flore, that was a southern Italian prophet, and also pretty heterodox. So even these beliefs were often looked upon with suspicion from the church, because the church didn't want, say, certain beliefs to go, viral, we can say, in our language today, because they feared they couldn't control that, and they could go astray from orthodoxy. So there is also this counter. Sometimes prophecies were a bit were debated in the first place, because it was like a bet. Let's see whether it happens or not. But there were also political tools. But you have to think that people really believed that. And in fact, when Frederick died, there was it was a monk from Parma that was fiercely against Frederick, and he said, I truly believed that Frederick was the Antichrist, and when he died, nothing happened, so I must have been wrong all along. So this is very fascinating, because it tells you how these people truly believed in such things. And these weren't people who lived isolated from reality, that didn't know anything. On the contrary, this author was coming from one of the noblest families of Parma, and that were deeply involved into war, into politics, into international trade. There were people who really knew what the world was about, and that still believed in such things. So this tells you another thing that I wasn't thinking about. I made myself thinking about it, is that most Christians at this time actually believed in astrology, which was something perfectly normal. Christians at this time said, okay, since, the sun was in that zodiac sign, in the ecliptic plan, and that planet was in that position and in conjunction with that other one, this flood happened, or this other event took place. They truly believed. It was a very mixed system of beliefs, and this allowed, by the way, to really give comfort, because in such a complicated, in such a complex and complicated system, you could really see everything as if it had been foreseen. You could say, this happened because of that, and everybody would believe that. And you don't have to think about that just as superstition in the negative sense that we attribute that today. Because if you had been living in such a world where you do not know physics, you genuinely believe in spirits and things. there was a lot of insecurity at that time, and these beliefs were a normal emotional reaction to for being safe in a world that couldn't give you, like today, science and knowledge and facts. And I mean, even today people still believe in such things. We don't have to figure all the conspiracy theories that are all around. We're not that different after all, so do not think bad of these people. And on the contrary, this is what I always do, what I always advise to do is to try to understand them, try to understand how complicated actually were the systems that we're thinking about. Because eventually science emerged from these beliefs. I mean, science emerged during the modern age, especially the basis of the physics we use today, from a system that in this sense was pretty much hybrid. I mean, science was only one thing together with alchemy, for instance, with magics, this thing. Astronomy and astrology were basically the same thing at the time. But it's paradoxically from this imperfect knowledge that it was an increasing tendency for trying to figure out something more, something new. And the Middle Ages were this great moment of systematization of research for a fixed point, for the truth that definitely was understood in a Christian sense, that is basically that the universe is something that has been created by God to be investigated and protected by mankind, because mankind has the duty to mankind has been given the world from God, and it's duty to keep it in a sort of ecological fashion. And that is, the mankind has a responsibility towards nature. And this is actually a very beautiful message. I mean, even if you want to read the Bible from this point of view, there are even lots of Christian theologians today that explain the Bible in this practically secular way. That is, let's look at the anthropological meaning of the Bible, aside from whether you believe in it or not, which can be really, really interesting. So, by the way, Chiliasm was something present also in certain sects. Let's say that at least in the primitive church there had been many currents, sometimes heterodox, when not heretic practically, that had stress. I mean, this obsession of the end of the world was near. Think about even the humiliation of the flesh. Think about at this time of the flagellants, as people basically marched into city streets and whipping themselves and scarifying their backs, or wearing thorns, and basically trying to destroy their flesh, trying to, in that sense, it was a Christian. I mean, it was meant to basically relieve Christ's physical experience of the Passion. So all the torture and the sufferings that they had, and these were very ancient practices. Like, they were definitely extremes in the sense that the majority of people already at the times believed that they were essentially the crazies, but there was a meaning attached to it that really tells you that this idea of the end of the world was near. Think about the 14th century Black Death and how that impacted Europe. I mean, we think that from the smallpox epidemics of the 6th century, there had of the Justinian times, there had never been such a devastating thing like the bubonic plague of 1348. and just think about 1/3 of European population wiped out, and that's a world, and it's not just about the death. You see, I mean, people dying, corpses rotting, unburied in the streets. So you can just think about what it means even to live like that. I mean, to be, I don't know, a child arising in there with those memories and all, and what kind of picture of the world you could have. But think also about the ensuing collapse of European society and economy. That actually doesn't seem to have appeared, because there was nothing like a collapse of society, but it was evident, at least from a sheer quantitative point of view, that there is a big fall down, a big crack of a lot of things at that day. And I mean, people at the time believed it was truly the end of the world, and this millennial views kick in again. Or at least they were increased, and this was pretty much the normality of the time, as crude as it can be. Which, by the way, I would like to stress this, that it was also compensated by a lust for life. We know that when the Black Death, because there is obviously a reaction, an exorcism necessary even to survive in that occasion. Think about Boccaccio, who wrote this extremely beautiful series of novels in the Decameron, of these bands of young men and women who had fled the city during the plague in the countryside, and were there living together, and you can imagine doing what, in part. This tension had always been also relative to sexuality, things about courtly love, I mean the ideals and then the reality. It was a pretty harsh world, and there was this, we can say, reaction of, people wanted to in front of all that massive debt, to kind of say, okay, let's live the few we have, and let's, I don't know, let's have sex, let's get drunk, and let's eat until exploding. And there was also this kind of, I think, from a moral point of view at the time, what this really entailed. I mean, it's really a world that is kind of in reverse, and we clearly get this from the sources of that time. Even though human rationality, in a certain sense, survives and society goes on, and in fact, what is striking is that obviously, if you make a dedicated study about such events, you realize that they, you pick every single source that states that, you put that together, and you say, oh, look, this is what they thought at the time. But if otherwise you look to a normal source that is like a chronicle, or that tells the whole story, and these things start to happen in the middle, most of the times it doesn't give you really the impression that anything particular happened. I mean, the whole story was told as if, I don't know, there was a big crisis, there were people dying, of course, but then political life went on the same way, and so also in here we don't have to indulge into this emotional dimension of history, because actually those times were so harsh that people didn't even lose their mind if something very serious happened, because they were kind of used to that, or at least they had an immediate reaction in order to survive and to make things going on. Because and that's, I think, a great thing of humans, of human society, that is able to recover even from such heavy blows. So generally speaking, the end of times, the descent of from the skies of the New Jerusalem. I mean, the book of the Apocalypse is pretty explicit. The Apocalypse is beautiful to read. Many people actually believe it's a sort of scary thing. At least popular culture is attached to to the apocalypse, this extremely negative or terrible thing. But actually, the apocalypse, even in its biblical meaning, is meant actually to be a comforting text for the believers. And there are just many cryptical messages. Some of them use sort of scary pictures, obviously, and images, but it's not really that thing. So even sometimes, if you had talked about the apocalypse in the Middle Ages, people would have been probably would have attached a less negative judgment to it than we actually do today for cultural prejudices and cliches. So, telling the truth, it also in here, by the way, a few people also in there knew the apocalypse, probably, especially in the countryside, or at least they had a very superficial knowledge of it and its meaning and its implication. So there was part, as I was saying before, the tendency not just to wait for this kingdom of justice to come, but actually to enjoy it in as long as you could, also in this own world. So even if the Christian message relatively to death is pretty comforting in the sense that actually the bad time is when you're alive, and then when you die you're actually gonna leave. Well, I'd say most people didn't really, at least unconsciously, didn't really buy that. So that's pretty obvious. I mean, I'm not criticizing here Christianity in itself. I'm just saying that it's instinctive for people to be scared by death. So this idea of time, of limited time, is pretty out there, and such reactions are kind of natural, even for good Christians, I believe, in part. So by the way, what I wanted to stress also in here is that when we look at the Middle Ages and that kind of mixed beliefs, we talked before about I don't know, astrology that was believed and all this stuff. You have to think that there was a very strong continuity from the from say the pagan world in the ancient times. I mean, sometimes we picture the Middle Ages as if it was something that was there on its own, with its own rules, with its own things. I think the best way you can study the Middle Ages is thinking that the Middle Ages have never actually existed, which is probably the most intelligent thing you can do in the first place. So getting rid of this thing. And you have to think that the whole world was coming essentially from a polytheistic mindset, and that it took really millennia sometimes, partly according to me it's not practically erased still, because so all these beliefs were actually coming from this extremely thick net of complicated and complex beliefs that all interacted one with each other, which is what is essentially polytheism had been about. So this couldn't really be wiped out by Christianity. Christianity was just the saving message that was so appealing, and definitely people believed genuinely in such things, but it was normal for them to still believe certain and even contractual things. I mean, still today, many Christians were actually ignorant about their own religion, think about things like, I don't know, if I pray God will help me materially. Well, just for the knowledge, this is paganism. This is not Christianism, it's pure paganism. Christianism tells, as well as Judaism, the same exact contrary, that you can't pray God just to have your own, say, to find strengths, but a true Christian has to accept everything that God sends. If you pray, if you think that Christianity is praying God for making you, you know, achieve something, or that's not it. The Bible is based on the message that you have to accept every single thing that arrives to you, and that those who suffer the most in this life are actually the ones that God loves the most. So in today's world, still, I don't know, it's almost, I think it's switching toward atheism at a point, but we still have those pagan beliefs. We still have those contractualistic beliefs that um, that were evidently so rooted in our past for such a long time that it's very difficult even to get rid of them in practice. So it was normal at the time to really, even at the time, to put a lot of things together, and we should think about this really as the normality in practice. And so there were a lot of prophetic texts that existed in circulation in the Christian world, at least from the 4th, 6th century, especially when Christianity was legalized and eventually made the official religion of state. So um, so these libelli, sometimes they have a very Sibylline nature. There was a lot of hermetism. Even think about the apocalypse. The apocalypse is very complicated to understand. It's very hermetic. It has a lot of meanings that are difficult to actually interpret. So this crypticism was definitely also part of these a pagan legacy in terms of exoterism, of this idea that there were certain levels of understanding that had to um, and there was a lot of, you could do a lot of playing on this, meaning that if you found this book, it was very ancient. It said that the end of time would come from this. I mean, you have to think about the value of authority from a literary point of view in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages were completely in love with the Romans, probably even more than the I mean, the Renaissance has kind of rationalized the fact that the Middle Ages had lost a concrete knowledge about what Roman world had actually been. But telling the truth, the Middle Ages were a time in which the standards of knowledge, of reality, of culture had been set by the Romans, and most of medievals believed that they were still living in the Roman world in practice. So the the value of the ancient authorities, especially the Christian ones, but in this sense were considered also as Roman ones, written in fact at the time of the Roman Empire, when it still existed in the West, and when it still existed in their mind, because the Holy Roman Empire for them was the Roman Empire. I mean, for Westerners it definitely was. Let's not get involved into the fact that it wasn't for juridical reasons, but that we can assess today as historians. But in those times, I don't know, a person who lived in Germany, well, they thought they were living into the Roman Empire, because that was it. Their monarch was a Roman king, and then Roman emperor. So it's kind of there was only one authority that was conceived as an ecumenic one, all one with the Christian belief. So if someone waved back in centuries a document that, I don't know, was written in the time of Constantine the Great, well, that was believed to be a direct thing. I mean, a very authoritative text, because it had been written in continuity in this Christian Roman Empire that evidently, at the times of Constantine, obviously had a loaded meaning with that. The idea of the Golden Age didn't stop to the earthly paradise of the Bible. It stemmed also to certain times in history. I mean, the medievals had definitely the perceptions that the Roman Empire had declined, and they believed that, I don't know, the greatest figures weren't Augustus, that was pagan. I mean, the great Roman emperors were, if someone remembered them, were Constantine and Justinian, partly also Theodosius, especially from a juridical point of view. Well, also Justinian, but these were the three big ones. They were all three Christian emperors, at least according to tradition, because about Constantine we don't really know. But aside from this, um, the the idea it was that those times had a sort of quality, an inherent quality, so that that everything that had been produced in those times was something special in some measure. It was loaded with um, with meaning. By the way, some people believe that today that those times in the late Empire was a sort of declining moment. In the Middle Age, they thought that that was the apex of the glory of the Roman Empire. And this is not really that historically wrong. Like the times of Constantine or Justinian were all but times of decline in practice. So then obviously other things occurred, but it was very important. The Middle Ages has to be understood through the perception of authorities that were really what made the difference in practice. Especially because in this world, as we were saying before, that there was no kind of fixed point, was no point of reference in practice. The political situation was fragmented. There was a big deal of customary tradition in all the local places. So this kind of more unitary past was seen as the only point of reference that existed. So many preachers and mystics, usually also pretty heterodox ones, were preaching continuously throughout all the Middle Ages that the end of times was near. And someone listened to them, naturally. Actually, most of the people listened to them. Some of them decided, I don't know, to abandon their worldly goods, to follow them, to have a life of penitence. It was really all one with even the Crusades. If you think about the Crusades, those were made in practice. One of the most, at least at an individual level, a big deal was of the motivation to join a crusade was to earn your salvation, your place in the kingdom of heaven, and this all came from an eschatological perspective that was felt to be like the end of the world is near. And the end of the world, in this sense, wasn't probably even, according to me, from an individual level, it wasn't really conceived as something really on a timeline, historically speaking. I mean, it's evident that these prophecies obviously stated, I don't know, the end of the world will arrive to this year. So, okay, let's prepare. But the end of the world has a greater meaning, anthropologically speaking. It's really also the end of your world, that is your own death. So the fact that the end of the world was so incumbent and that could arrive at any moment was definitely also a push for, you know, and these texts, these preachings, really were meant to really prepare spiritually for death and even for the individual death. And we explained why. We tried to explain why. I mean, such in a world with such a high mortality rate, like the one of that time was, it's pretty meaningful. There is another idea, though, that is a bit more historiographical. That is that we hinted at before a little bit. That is the idea of the year 1000 as a bit of a watershed. In my videos, sometimes I also stated things like the rebirth of the year not the year 1000, but it's usually of the 11th, 12th century, and this is also something that is being a bit debated, because relatively to the fears of the year 1000, it's not much about the myth and the picture of people waiting during the night for the end of the world, and but it really the idea that there was a sort of difference between, let's say, what happened later I mean, after the year 1000, what happened before. And also in here, the year 1000 is a completely arbitrary year that has been chosen symbolically speaking, exactly because of these millennial prejudices, but that really has a meaning historiographically speaking, this, let's say, rebirth or reprisal of European demographics and economics. That is something that stretches on a much longer time. Actually, the rise of Europe from the early medieval centuries, the very first centuries of the Middle Ages, actually seems to have been a very long and very complex phenomenon that actually started from the 8th century, kind of stopped at the end of the 13th, and that you can't really say that even the 11th century was the moment of greater spread. I personally think that actually was a bit accelerating, because at least with the 10th century, 9th, 10th, and second half of the 9th and 10th century, usually it was a pretty turbulent time in Europe. So there were the second invasions, was a lot of seemingly also partial certain environmental things. So usually that century is considered as a bit of moment at best of style of European growth, but that's also partly false, because probably even because of with all the problems that existed at the time, it was still a moment of expansion. Sometimes our perception is really based on the emotional perceptions of the people who wrote in those times. So it's like today, there are a lot of people who believe that the world is declining right now. But as a matter of fact, people who will study our days from 100 years from now will say, okay, this was actually a moment of maybe of crisis in part, but it was still a moment of growth, of expansion. Was, I don't know, there were other things. Was the internet that changed a lot of things. It was they will not see that in the emotional way we do, and this is very important from a historical point of view, because sometimes we sense certain periods in history on the emotional judgment of people who lived in them. It's like you said, I don't know, think about people who went through World War II. I mean, World War II was won, let's say, eventually by, well, let's leave this aside for now, but I mean, there were people in that time who surely saw that as a catastrophe, like a destruction of the world in part. Think about even better, because World War II is usually told at least in a positivistic way, in a positive way, like, yeah, okay, it was a terrible disaster, but in the end, at least, there was some result. Europe grew again. It was mostly during actually the anti-war protest movements during the Vietnam War in the 60s, in the 70s, that actually was this incumbent idea of the end of the world. Take Barry McGuire, Eve of Destruction, this idea. I mean, at that time, probably there were lots of people who believed such things. You hear that message today relatively to those times, it kind of laughable. I mean, beautiful song. I love that song personally, but aside from an artistical point of view, it makes me laugh because it's a very naive idea. The one that I think he neither states, if I'm not wrong, about the atomic holocaust, which is what could actually happen. But he only saw this war that actually after World War II we know that were very contained. In those times, it was one of the most pacific times in history. Paradoxically, also thanks to the threat of that nuclear weapons pose in terms of deterrence. So this flaring of war that is described, it's actually nothing in comparison to what had been, I don't know, in the first half of the 20th century with the two world wars. And yet, I personally don't sense that from a cultural point of view, those were moments in which people were thinking that the world was about to end. I mean, there was a great dissatisfaction, a great disappointment probably. There was a great crisis in many ways, but I mean, the first half of the 20th century was conceived, however, as a sort of rise, maybe an dishuman rise, maybe because of how what technology could achieve, also in terms of mass destruction and all. But you don't sense the end of the world at that point. Well, I should be honest, relatively to the anti-war movements, that there was definitely a moment into which Cold War could evolve, escalate into actually pretty hot war, and have the world destroyed. So it kind of makes sense, but even in its criticism in this sense. But even by knowing people who lived at those times, like my parents, I realized that yeah, there was this, but they weren't even much aware of that. I mean, I probably know much more about Cold War than they do, and they told me, yeah, that there was this fear that it could be the war, but people lived anyway, and that they didn't care extremely much about it. For instance, because of think about the media. We were talking about the sources of the medieval history, but the media, the 20th century, will be some of the most powerful sources for telling those times, and my parents remember the Cuba crisis, because that was something that was actually aired. I mean, it was a it was a global thing. People watched that on television. There were news. There was the threat of this escalation between the U.S. and the Soviets and all. But for instance, the I think it was 1983 Able Archer incident. That is the moment into which actually people went the closest to the nuclear holocaust of the whole planet, and nobody actually even knew that. I mean, it was something that was known like I think 2 years afterwards, in at least in mass culture, in pop culture, and still most of the people who lived in through those years actually do not even know that thing happened, because they lived in a world that was told to them from the television. Another thing that makes me laugh is that when there was in the first Persian Gulf War, before Desert Storm, when it is clear that the Western coalition would have invaded Iraq, and there was evidently no threat whatsoever in general to the situation. I mean, there was a general hysteria in Western countries to go buy food, to stock food supplies, because they thought that by I don't know, because of the Americans invading Iraq, there would have been a nuclear war or something like that. I mean, people are so irrational. And this partly derives from ignorance, because nobody would do such a thing today. It's a wholly different looking at the world. We're talking about essentially 30 years ago. So this big parenthesis is just for saying that when you look at the past times, you have also to understand who is telling what. Because relatively to the fear of the end of the world in the year 1000, surely the majority of the people probably didn't even pose themselves the problem. And we kind of got this, aside from the historiographical reconsiderations that were done a couple of centuries ago. The only sources that tell about this sometimes are the only ones we have, and that were maybe written in the monasteries, where they maybe counted time more precisely, or by other people who had a certain ego. But I mean, the average European inhabitant, we said, was the peasant living in countryside. Do you think that they even knew that it was the year 1000? They didn't. So we got tricked simply by the nature of the sources, and while the reality was another thing. In fact, relatively to this, I was reading another interesting idea that is, in French historiography, and I don't know if you are aware of this, but the French have always been very passionate. I mean, it's true that they had the French Revolution that kind of demonized the Middle Ages and tried to, but France has been the land of the Great Kingdom of France, so it's practically the most influential, single influential political authority, perhaps just after Papal Rome, of the Middle Ages, and that produce chivalry, feudal, and there is a current in medieval historiography that now it's kind of over, I believe, that, however, stressed really the let's say the view, the fact that the medieval world had this kind of irrational view of the world, but not irrational in a negative sense, on the contrary, but this idea, for instance, that the world was a great symbol, that implicitly was a sacred one, and that was this kind of sensitivity as well, towards this thing that people believed, etc. But and that the whole Middle Ages was gravitating around these ideals of universalism and all. Actually, today we look at that in a wholly different way. Essentially, we realize that these concepts were there, but usually only in the cultural elite that managed to express such complex conceptions and to write about them and to discuss them and to produce texts and to debate them and to use them politically speaking and all. But the majority of the people really did think that the world at the time was a sacred symbol. And first of all, did they rationalize that? Because it is true, most of the, probably especially in the countryside, people looked at the world in a way that was pretty similar to the pagan one, that is essentially attaching a particular meaning to that specific thing, that is, I don't know, that spring, that forest, that sanctuary, I mean, as something on its own. But they didn't really believe that it fit in a broader system that kind of probably the average medieval person didn't. And it wasn't probably either so ethically challenged by in fact, we know that this, if, for instance, the contempt towards the peasants, towards the villains, I mean, there was a great contempt that almost reaches practically racism at the level, in fact, of genetic base towards the peasantry in the Middle Age. I mean, the idea of the noble blood versus the one of the peasants was, some of those guys were considered essentially like animals, or as demi-human beings. And we have that perception only because we have the sources of those who contempted the peasants, that were chiefly the nobles, because those are the sources that normally survived, at least also in the ecclesiastical environment that it was usually, especially from the low Middle Ages, mostly aristocratically dominated. At least it was still a social class that felt itself kind of superior to the peasantry. So the worst imaginable things were said about these peasants, including the fact that they were completely ignorant, that they copulated continuously, that they were they had beast-like manners, that they, that they had no actual education of sorts, that they were bred like wild animals. And do you think that those and it's probably even very correct, obviously take aside the contempt that existed towards them, but do you really think that those people actually knew, given their level of let's say inexistent level of education in most cases, that they knew anything about these things, that they even posed themselves the problem. Probably they were scared. I mean, if they heard a priest, they were probably first of all, they would barely understand what he would say, but probably they looked at him as a sort of authoritative figure that could say something. I don't know. They had to mind, but probably they didn't have the intellectual means to actually interiorize that. I mean, as long as the priest went away, they still thought about their own business. And I'm not saying that these people were stupid. Don't get me wrong at all. I think actually those peasants were probably more intelligent than what we are, because they could survive in an environment that was much more difficult than our own. And they did that entirely with their own forces, so they also had to have a sharp mind for certain things. But in terms of these broader sort of structural conceptions, the end of the world, the year 1000, do you think a medieval peasant was able to rationalize that? I don't think so. And probably they didn't even know what we're talking about. And by the way, there were certain communities of the ancient, even in modern Europe, I think in certain cases, especially if you take Northern Europe, that really kept living completely isolated from the rest of civilization. Like, I think Christianity, especially in some parts, I don't know, of northern Germany, of the Scandinavian countries, for not talking about Eastern Europe, I mean, it really, it arrived maybe in the local diocese, with the foundation of the local diocese. It arrived to the elites and all, but do you think that the peasantry actually knew anything about that? There were peasants living, really, communities living in even in places of very difficult access, of physical access. I mean, even in closer places like in France or in Germany, there is the so-called world of the forest. That is, communities that lived entirely detached from the rest of the of society, based on cities, on feudal estates, and all that had all their own beliefs. And so this is why the fear of the year 1000 is a myth, at least in the way it's been told to us. Then surely there were certain worries about this, because it's evident that those people who knew that that would be the AD 1000, they would care about that. I mean, if they were educated enough to understand numbers, to understand what that could symbolically mean, surely probably they got worried, and around the year 1000 was definitely some sort of tension or separation, but it was probably expressed by a very contained number of people. So I think this is the best approximation I can give. This is it for now, and I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.